Hey there, I'm Brittany, and thanks for clicking on this YouTube video. If you're not familiar with Cape Cod Church, you can check out our website at capecodchurch.com to learn more. Otherwise, we hope that you enjoy this message in our Jesus in the Letters series, and I'll see you again at the end of the service.
Good morning. Well, welcome. It's good to see all of you. Yeah, and welcome to everybody online. We know lots and lots of people are joining us online, and as Britt mentioned, a special welcome to everybody over on Nantucket. And we know we've got a growing group, and we're pretty excited to see what God does with that. You're like, what's the plan? I don't know. We're just kind of walking and seeing what God does and wanting to be faithful with what he puts in front of us. So a shout out to Alan and Kaylani who are leading that effort, and to all that are joining us on the island that will. We're pretty excited to see where God goes. So, we are in the third week. Here's all I got to say. Get out your Bible and buckle up. It's going to take about 40 minutes, but we're going to go on a whirlwind tour. But first, I thought, okay, maybe 35 minutes. We'll see how fast I can talk, okay? First, I thought maybe a little bit of background. Let me kind of set the stage of where we've been, because we're talking about Jesus in the letters, because 21 of the 27 books of the New Testament were actually letters that were written to either churches or in a few cases individuals, but were meant for a larger audience, and they take the story of Jesus and they turn it into the way of Jesus, right? They tell us the story and it becomes the way of living out Jesus' story in this world. So I thought that what might really help is that if we did a little bit of geography class. So I'm going to show you a map. I'm going to put this up here so that you can follow. Now, you don't have to memorize this. There's no test. This is way better than high school. But sometimes a little bit of an image will help you to see kind of what's happening here. So you look down in the lower right-hand corner, the little green there. You can see that's Israel down there. There's Jerusalem. That's kind of where it all gets started, right? That's the mother church. But then you can see a lot of stuff is happening through what's called the Roman Empire. Pretty much everything you see in this map is called the Roman Empire. I'm taking you back to high school history class, right? And so you can see a couple weeks ago, we talked about Galatia. That's that first green area there. That was the first missionary trip. It happens in the late 40s, so about 15 years after the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Then you can see in that kind of blue area, that's what it's called Asia, but it's Asia Minor. It's modern day Turkey, right? So this is lots of stuff. We're going to come back to that. So kind of hold Asia kind of in the back of your mind. And then if you kind of jump back up over that little bit of water over into what you see is called Thrace and Macedonia, right? Now we're getting into, and we're going to spend some time here today, because in Macedonia, you see Thessalonica. We were there a week ago. You see Philippi. We're going to get there in a minute. If you went down south into Achaia, you'd see Athens. You'd see Corinth. We're going to get to Corinth next week. And then if you jump all the way over, remember the boot? High school, the boot. That was the only thing you could recognize on a map. The one thing you got right, the boot, right? The boot is Italy, right? And so you go up Italy and you see Rome, and Rome is literally the center of the world. It's the power center of the world. Now, here's an interesting thing about this map, and the reason I put it up there. Paul is leveraging the technology of his lifetime, right? So the technology was not like an iPhone, but I'm pretty sure if Paul were here, he'd have the app, he'd have the internet. He would have figured out how to leverage all of that technology in an effort to spread the gospel. So Paul is leveraging two things. He's leveraging the seaports, and you'll see that many of these cities are all built around all of these seaports, and Paul is leveraging his ability to travel the world through all of these seaports, and he's leveraging something else: Roman roads. Now, if you grew up in the kind of church I did, you heard the Romans Road. It was like a bunch of verses in the book Romans, but that was because we really wanted to talk about, back up. I'm not done. You got ahead of me there. I thought you giving away the good stuff. Hold on. Right? So the Roman roads, the most famous one is the Appian Way, right? The Via Appia. So that runs from Rome all the way down to the heel of the boot, right? And then from the heel of the boot, it jumps over. That's the end of the Appian Way. You jump over onto the other side, and you have a road that we've mentioned a few times called the Via Ignatia, right? That's just the Ignatian Road. And the Ignatian Road kind of starts at that yellow piece, and then it bops over, and it travels all of those seaports all the way over right to the edge of what's modern-day Turkey, just to the edge of Asia. And what you're going to see is you're going to watch a lot of these. In fact, now we can go ahead. We can see this next one. You can actually see this is the Via Ignatia. You can walk this road today. The remnants of it are still there, still in use in some ways. There, it's good. In fact, are those solar lights? That's pretty epic. Yeah, they've got solar lights on the Via Ignatia. So, 2,000-year-old road, and they're updating it with solar. Okay, good. You can go. We can put all that away now. So, here's why I said all of that to say Paul is using these roads and these seaports in an effort to spread the gospel. He's using them so he can travel city to city to city to city to establish churches. And then after, he's sending letters back, and he's sending these letters along these roads and along these seaports in these population centers that are growing to expand the gospel message. So, all of that's background. Now, it's 20 years after Jesus has been crucified and buried and risen again. We're in the 50s, not the 1950s, the original 50s. And Paul finds himself in prison. It's not the only time he's in prison. And we're not exactly sure which moment or which place. We know he was imprisoned at Rome, but we also sense he was imprisoned at Ephesus and Caesarea. We don't know exactly. I'm just giving you, there's a little bit of, but we know he's in prison, and it's the mid-50s, and he sits down to write 4 more letters. You would think, prison is just a time to take a break. Right? Wait it out. Maybe pout a little. Like, really? Really, God? I did all of this and I'm in prison? But prison also, it turns out, is a place of clarity. Maybe prison and the seasons of waiting are where we hear from God. And the work and the voice of His Spirit speaks powerfully into our lives. And it's here, in prison, that Paul writes 4 powerful letters. We call them famously the prison epistles. Remember, epistles is just a word for letters, the prison letters. I want to take those as a group today. That's why I said buckle up. There's 4 of them. We could spend a year on these and not give everything in. So I'm going to give you an overview. And here's what you might want to do. You might get to the end of this and go, one of them like, oh, that was really interesting. Any of these books, you could sit down and in about 15 minutes time, maybe 30 at max, you could read the entire thing. So my hope is that I wet your whistle a little bit and you're like, that's interesting. I'd like to see that. So here's where Paul turns his attention to first. First, Paul turns to the city of Philippi. That means he goes all the way over. We think he's likely writing from either Rome or Ephesus, but let's go with Ephesus. So he writes from Asia, and he sends this letter over into Macedonia to the city of Philippi. Now, Philippi is a city that's 400 years old, and it was established by Philip of Macedonia. Philip was Alexander the Great's son. Now, I think if you're Alexander the Great's son, it's not cool enough just to be called Phil. So you need something better than Phil. So he became Philip of Macedonia. And then if you're like your dad's like Alexander the Great, you gotta leave your mark. So this is his city, and he builds it out and creates it as a commerce center, and it becomes what we would come to know in Paul's time, 400 years later, as Philippi. And Paul is writing to Philippi, this growing great city, and he says something that there's lots of things that we could kind of pick up from this passage, but he says something that I just thought was worth camping out on for a minute. Let me read it to you. In chapter 1, in verse 3, he says, "Every time I think of you, I give thanks to my God. Whenever I pray, I make my requests for all of you with joy, for you have been my partners in spreading the good news about Christ from the time you first heard of it until now. And I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. But I want to wind back to that little phrase where he says, you have been my partners. The phrase here, they tell us, this phrase actually talks about my financial partners. They were supporting him in the cause. They were embracing that cause, and they were making it their own. They were living it out. And he doesn't say this about everyone. In fact, next week we're going to get to Corinth, and he very specifically says of the Corinthians that he wouldn't take anything from them. But from the Philippians, he calls them his partners. Now, here's what's interesting. If you grew up like I did, in a church that used the King James Version of the Bible, then you may remember that this passage actually says, for you, we fellowship in the gospel. Thank you for your fellowship in the gospel. I've always thought it was an odd phrase, your fellowship in the gospel. But here, and in almost all modern translations, it translates it as your partnership, which is a much more accurate, and it conveys the sense of it. You're my partners. But they use this word fellowship, your fellowship in the gospel. And when I remember when I was a kid, I was like, fellowship in the gospel. Another place it talks about fellowshipping in my sufferings, right? You're partaking in my sufferings. But here he says, fellowshipping in it, you're partaking in this. And I always thought, like, fellowship, like I grew up in church that we had Sunday night potluck fellowship. Remember, anybody, how many people went to a potluck fellowship? How many people miss potluck fellowship? There's something about there. That's right, because that was awesome, wasn't it? And it was Sunday night, and you get done with church, and you go down, and if you were a kid, you slip down early so you could get at the front of the line. Here we go, right? You go to the end of the line where the dessert stuff is, and we just fellowship. But there was always a purpose behind it. Beyond just we're going to fellowship together, because usually the fellowship coincided with something. It coincided with maybe a guest speaker, but often in my experience, it coincided with our missionary partners coming in, and they would hold this fellowship. They were like, hey, we're going to have a fellowship. And here's what they were trying to do. It was very, very sly. I know this because I learned it and I've done it, right? So they were trying to get you to get out of the seat, to move from being a spectator to a participator. And the way they were doing that is through fellowship, because fellowship, that connection, was a relationship. True story. Years and years later, we were trying to have our very first missions conference. It's going to be like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday missions thing. And for the first time, I was trying to get our very small church to come out on a Friday night for missions. I knew this was not the easiest thing to convince people to do. So I thought, we're going to have a fellowship. I call it an international dinner. We're gonna have it from all these countries that we're having, and I thought on Friday night, people will come. And I thought, just in case, I'm gonna have people sign up to bring food, because then they have to come. See how savvy I am? So everybody signed up. I'm like, Mark, this is gonna be a great evening, and our guests were in town. And I don't know, maybe it was like 6:30, and it starts at 7, and people started showing up, and they were carrying in their dishes. I'm like, yes, this is going to be awesome. And they dropped them off, and they left. I'm like, whoa, where are you going? No. The point is to stay, not just to give them to stay, because I want you to meet this person. I want you to engage with them. There's a fellowship, but what he's talking about here is a partnership. And listen, what Paul is saying out is something very, very important that's been passed down to the church for generations and generations and generations, is that when we give, and this isn't a message about giving, but it's a good point for us just to stop and consider. When we give, we are partnering in the gospel, right? Listen, I know that the government considers churches a 501c3 nonprofit, but listen, none of us, we don't believe this. We don't believe that we give to a charity. Church is not a charity, right? When we give, we're partnering in the gospel. We're giving because we believe in the mission of this thing, and it traces itself all the way back to these words of Paul saying, you're my partner. When I go out and do this, you're a part of this. You're supporting this. You're embracing it. You're investing in the work of the gospel around the world. And whatever happens with me is happening with you. And here we are, 2,000 years later. And I'm so proud of what God does at Cape Cod Church and how you partner in the gospel and step into it and pour yourself into it. Even in a year like we've gone through this past year, you just like stepped it up. It's like, listen, this is what we do. This is what we're for. This above everything else is the most important thing that we give to, we invest in, we partner in. Even if we can't be in the building, we are part of that. And it traces itself all the way back to these words written to the people of the church of Philippi. Now, Paul has more to say. And so he shifts his attention from Macedonia and Philippi to Asia. An interesting thing that's happening here. Paul is, for the very first time, he is writing all of these letters to towns that are almost exclusively Gentile, right? These are not Christian, these are not places where there's large Jewish populations. And when this began, it would go to the synagogues, and he'd begin preaching in the synagogues, and he would go to the Jewish population. But now he's writing to places that are almost exclusively Gentile. And the churches would bear that out. Like the churches there would be some Jews who would come over and converted, but mostly he was reaching now into Gentile populations. And he turns his attention and he writes to the city of Colossae. And he's writing now into what's modern day Turkey or Asia Minor. And he writes into Colossae. Now, here's the interesting thing about Colossae, and I wasn't aware of this until I was getting ready for this message. Colossae has never been fully excavated. In fact, there's a group that over the next decade is planning. You can do this, about a 22-acre site that they know this is where it is, but it's never been fully excavated. But we still know some of what's happening in the city. And it turns out one of the ways that they know what was happening in the city is by the coinage that was coming out of that area. And so when they can look at the coinage, they can tell like what they were worshiping. And this is what's really interesting. So when they look at the coinage that was coming out of the area of Colossae, they see that about a third of all the coins that they find are not surprisingly coins that venerate the deity Artemis or Diana. We're going to come to that in just a minute because that was centered in Ephesus, a little bit further south. But then there were also coins that were venerating the empire cult. That was the worship of the Roman emperor as a god. But then there were all of these others, right? And they had gods to health and gods to food and food supply and gods to pleasure and pretty much anything you could find. They had a god that kind of served in that place. Now, all of that is really interesting because it's into that context that Paul writes to the church. Into this place where there's this like cauldron of competing religions and the cult of the emperor and the worship of Diana or Artemis and all of these gods. And so Paul writes into this place. And what he does in the book of Colossians chapter 1, and we're going to pick up in about verse 15. So in verse 15, what he actually is writing here is he's writing a little bit of it's a song, what we would call a doxology. That's a hymn of theology, right? A song of belief. But watch what it is that he writes, because it's one of the most powerful single statements about Christ and about God. Listen to this. Just like let these words sink in as Paul writes to these people in this region, in this church. There's a mix. There's every kind of belief going on around them. And he writes this: Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. Period. Whoa. Like there it is. Like Jesus Christ was the visible. We could see him. We could touch him, of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. For through him, God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones and kingdoms and rulers and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. He existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. Paul is doubling down on Jesus. He is everything. He was before everything. He created everything. He existed before anything else, verse 17, and he holds all creation together. Then he says, verse 18, Christ is also the head of the church, which is his body. He is the beginning, supreme over all who rise from the dead. So he is first in everything. For God, in all his fullness, was pleased to live in Christ. And through him, God reconciled everything to himself. He made peace with everything in heaven and on earth by means of Christ's blood on the cross. I don't know exactly how they sang that, but my goodness, reading it is this powerful declaration about the supremacy of Jesus Christ. He is supreme over everything. And Paul was pushing back against something they were dealing with then that we're dealing with now. We have a modern word for it. Let me give you the word. It's called syncretism. It's easy. When you read it on paper, it looks like it's complicated. Like you don't want to say it out loud for fear of saying it wrong. Syncretism. Think like syncing things, like syncing your phone to your car, or you're lining them up. But syncretism is a religious term. Syncretism is the mixing, the blending, the amalgamation of religious beliefs together. And then, like now, it was common, right? It's like, hey, we're going to take a bit of this, and 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 we'll put them all together, and we'll have us a relatable religion. We'll have something that is palatable to everybody because we got one of these and one of these and one of these and one of these. And I see this happening all the time. I talk with people all the time who, when you ask them and you start talking about beliefs, the words that come out, the beliefs that come out, like there's a little bit of Buddhist meditation slipped in. We call that mindfulness. And then we bring in a little bit of New Age power of the universe, like the energy of the universe. And in our day and age, you can't just have mindfulness. You can't just have like Buddhist meditation. You can't just have the power and the energy of the universe. You got to bring in a little bit of self-help, because we love self-help. We need a little bit of the power of positive thinking, because if you got a little bit of mindfulness and a little bit of the power of the universe, and you got a little bit of self-help, a little bit of positive, God does for you what you can do for yourself kind of thing, and you put all that stuff around Jesus. I'm not saying we put it over Jesus, we just like pack it around Jesus. Certainly that will make it more relatable, more acceptable. But what it's done is it's watered down the supremacy of Jesus Christ. It's taken away the power. Let me illustrate this way. I don't know about you. I'm a sauce guy. I love good sauces like honey barbecue, honey mustard. Some of you are nodding. You get one with me, right? You're like, yeah, bring it on, man. A little bit of ranch. Like ranch goes good with everything. Like started out salads. Now we use it for pizza crust, right? It's like, love me some ranch. But my favorite, I don't know where I picked. How did I miss this? I only discovered in the past year, sriracha. I love me some sriracha. Like, sriracha go good on everything, right? Sriracha on your eggs, sriracha on your burger, sriracha in your soup. I'm telling you, you haven't tried it. Sriracha in your soup is the deal. It works. It's awesome. Like, sriracha goes good on just about everything but salad, and there may be a way to make that work, right? Sriracha, like put that sauce on, you put it off of that. But here's the thing. After a while, you realize that you're just making everything taste like sriracha. And he said, okay, what does that have to do with Colossians? Because Jesus is saying, I don't need no sauce. That's what I'm saying. You get what that passage is saying? He's going, no, don't you put no sriracha on me. Sriracha? Listen, put sriracha on something else. That's what he's saying here. He's like putting it out. He's like, whoa, listen, he is supreme over everything. And whenever you try and add something or take away something or put something over or water it down, you reduce the power and the supremacy of Jesus Christ because he is over and before everything and anything. And Paul is saying to these people who are trying to figure out how the story of Jesus becomes the way of Jesus in the midst of all of these competing beliefs. And he says, no sauces, no sauces. This one right here, I made this perfect. Jesus is all by himself. But we're not done. We're halfway done, right? I'm going to move fast because Paul has another letter to write. But now he wants to write to an individual. And he actually is about, it's almost like, I need to write to Philemon. See, Philemon was the host. He owned the home. The church at Colossae was just getting rolling, and it met in his house. And Paul's like, I got to write to Philemon. He's a leader in the church. And he's my son in the faith. Like I led him to the Lord. Like I got influence with Philemon. And he has to write him about a tricky subject because along the way, while he was in prison, Paul had met a young man named Onesimus. Onesimus was a slave. Onesimus was actually Philemon's slave. We don't know exactly how Onesimus found his way to Paul, but Paul started telling him the story of Jesus, and Onesimus becomes a believer. But there's a problem because they live in a culture where slavery is not only legal, it's completely acceptable. No one anywhere, anyhow, is questioning the institution of slavery. Not one bit. Slaves came in all kinds of different ways. Some were born into slavery. Some were captured. Their city, their nation was conquered, and they were led away as slaves. And some were sold. In fact, some sold themselves into slavery. They would have a debt that had to be paid, and the only way that they could pay off that debt was to sell themselves into slavery. No matter what, slavery meant one thing. They had lost the right of refusal. Paul writes into this, and when he writes into it, he's about to do something that upends the entire system of slavery because it's subversive. Remember that word? He's going to do something that's you almost don't see it happening. And so he now has this new son in the faith, Onesimus. He calls him a brother. And he writes to his other son in the faith. Watch this, Philemon. Oh, I have a son in the faith. I have a new son in the faith. You know what that makes you? That makes you brothers. And he begins to upend this system. Let me read to you just a few of the words from Philemon. It's just one chapter long. So if you wanted to pick a quick book to read this afternoon, pick Philemon, right? This is just one chapter. I'm picking up in verse 15. Here's what it says. It seems you lost Onesimus for a little while. He's writing to Philemon, right? So that you could have him back for forever. Verse 16, he is no longer like a slave to you. He is more than a slave, for he is a beloved brother. And now Paul starts to twist the knife, especially to me. Now, he will mean much more to you, both as a man and a brother. Do you see the dignity that he's given him? He's placing a new subversive truth. He's challenging the system and the culture. He's saying, here's a new way. And this man is more than you thought. He's a man and he's a brother in Christ. So then he says, verse 17, so if you consider me your partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. Welcome him as you would welcome me. And with that, Paul begins to subvert this system. And he establishes that within the church, the culture, that we would move one redemptive movement at a time closer to what God's idea was. If I can't get you from here to here, I'll get you from here to here, and then to here, and then to here. And he establishes at the very outset this truth that this man is a man and a brother. Now, we could spend a little bit of time talking about how God works through redemptive movement to bring us closer and closer and closer to his ideal for the world. And we could talk about slavery and all of that, and it would be an important conversation. I'm afraid we couldn't do it justice in time, but I just want to take a minute to say this, because I want to talk about something a little bit more personal, because here's the reality. We often, as a culture, accept things that God doesn't accept. Just because it's legal, just because it's acceptable, doesn't mean that God approves of it. And God often messes with our messes. He steps into our junk. And in our junk, he's like, let me subvert that just a little bit. I was doing an interview this past week. I'll give you an illustration of how this works. Group Vision New England had said, hey, we're doing these podcast interviews, and I agreed to do it. And so they sent me some questions in advance. Here's some things we'd like to talk to. And at the very end, they said, hey, tell us what your favorite verse is. So they give you a little, so now you're like, what's my favorite verse? I don't know that I have a favorite verse. I should come up with a good favorite verse, right? Because people will be listening, what's a spiritual sounding favorite verse? And our people from the church will be watching John 10:10. That's an awesome verse. You come to give us life and life more abundantly. I talk about that verse all the time, right? John 3:16, God so loved the world. That's a favorite verse. But there was something in me that said two things. One that says, that's kind of boring, and it's not true. It was like the Spirit was saying, why don't you tell them the verse you go to most often? Oh, because I don't know if it's my favorite, Lord. Yeah, but you read it all the time. And it's much more interesting. Oh, it's true. So I share with them James chapter 4. I've preached on this passage multiple times. James chapter 4. It's not one verse, it's 10 verses. I love verse 10. When we bow down before the Lord and admit our dependence on him, he will lift us up and give us honor. That's the good part, folks. But it's the first verse that just terrifies me. Because the first verse says, where do all the wars and fightings among you come from? Don't they come from your own evil desires? You want what you don't have. So you kill, and you scheme, and you deceive to get it. Oh, I can't tell you how many times I've gone back to that passage in a season of angst or tension or worry, and God has just brought me back and said, whoa, where's that coming from? You want something you don't have. You see, this is what God does. God often takes us through a season of uncomfortable because his goal is not to make us comfortable, it's to make us better. And in order to make us better, sometimes he has to just take us through this season of breaking us up and pulling stuff away and messing with our messes so that he can make us better. And that's the message of Philemon. It's listen, I'm going to mess with you, but it's going to be awesome. Wait till you see what I do. I don't have much time left, but he's got one more book he wants to write. And it's almost like he saved the best for last. It's whoa. He writes to the great city of Ephesus. So Ephesus was considered to be the third greatest. Only Rome and Alexandria were greater cities in all of the world at that moment. You can go to Ephesus today, and it is dominated by stadiums and amphitheaters, and it's just the ruins, and the archaeology is incredible. And in the center of life was one building. It would become known as one of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis, or as the Romans called her, Diana. In fact, I brought a picture here because I thought you got to see this. This is a rendering of what it looked like, the city of Ephesus. Here's what it looks like today. I'll show you. We'll move along pretty quick. Those are the ruins of it. You can still go see today. One of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world. The center of life in Ephesus, this great city of 200,000 people, was the worship of Diana, of Artemis. It was temple worship and temple prostitutes. People from around the world came because through this sexual worship of Diana and Artemis, that you could find fulfillment. It's no wonder that Paul would later have to write to the leader of this church his own set of letters. His name was Timothy, just to tell him, hey, you got a tiger by the tail. You're trying to lead a church in the middle of Ephesus. Hang on. This is what you got to do. But here, he writes to the church. And in my other favorite passage from James 4, he writes in Ephesians chapter 3, this powerful, in fact, it's often referred to as Paul's great high priestly prayer. But he offers this prayer, and I just want to read it to you and then draw a quick application before we close. He says this, Ephesians chapter 3, writing to the church in the middle of this city where it's dominated by the image of that great temple and the worship and the fulfillment promised through Artemis, he writes this, when I think of all this, talking about the story of Jesus, I fall to my knees and pray to the Father, the creator of everything in heaven and on earth. And I pray that from his glorious, unlimited resources, he will empower you with inner strength through his Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him. And your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. And may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide and how long and how high and how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to fully understand. Then you will be made complete with all the fullness of life and the power that comes from God. Listen, here's what he's saying. Listen, before you do anything, the fulfillment that's promised by that great temple is nothing. Let your roots, don't let them go down into that. Let your roots grow down deep into the love of God. Because if you'll understand how high and how deep and how wide his love for you is, if you will experience a glimpse of how much he loves you, that glimpse of his love will fill you with all the power and all the fullness that you're searching for. Just know how much he loves you. He loves you. Why is that so important? He loves you. I mean, he says everything else. He said, put everything else aside. Just know this. He loves you. He loves you. Just catch a glimpse of this. He loves you. Because if you'll just know a little bit of that, the fullness you're searching for, you'll find it. The power you need, you'll find it. Tim and I have raised we're not quite done, 4 kids. Which means that we've had a lot of years of school events, sporting events, end of the year ceremonies, graduations, award ceremonies. Here's something I've discovered. I love award ceremonies. Every parent loves. I'm just like any other parent. I love seeing my kids get stuff. I just love seeing them excel. I love seeing them applauded. I love seeing them win stuff. Whatever it is. And so we've, like everybody, we go to these awards, and we all sit there like, wouldn't it be awesome if they got something? You know what I'm saying? It's not that I'm rooting against your kid. I'm just rooting for my kid. So here's what I've noticed, because I'm a veteran. Oftentimes, if your kid's going to get something, the school calls you first. It's true. Mr. Feldott, we just wanted to make sure you were going to be at the award ceremony today. Oh, yes, I will. Cancel all my appointments. Right? They're not telling you exactly what's going to happen, but they're like, oh, you should be there. You should be there. Listen, I don't know what they're getting. They might get a participation award. They might get an award for showing up on time. Actually, none of our kids have ever gotten an award for showing up on time. But I don't know, but I know, they're saying, hey, you should be there. So I'm going to tell you, here's what happens. And listen, I'm talking about the difference between living with anxiousness and the difference between living with expectation. I'm saying that I go and I sit there and I'm like, something good's going to happen. I don't know what. Something good's going to happen. I'm just waiting. They give out the first one, it's not them. I'm not nervous because I know something good's going to happen. In fact, my experience has been they often save the best awards for last. So if your kid doesn't get anything and you know something's coming at its very end, that's only good news. Here's what I'm saying. God called. He said, hey, I got something for you. Live with expectation. I got something good for you. I love you. I love you. If you could catch a glimpse of how deep and how wide my love for you is, you would live with expectation. All of that anxiousness, all of that bitterness, all of that worry begins to fall away because he called and he said, hey, I love you. I love you. And I'm not done. And that's the message from prison. I'm not done. Would you bow with me? Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. Whew. We have covered some territory. From partnership in ministry to the supremacy of Christ, to a God who messes with our comfortable dysfunction, to a God who whispers, I love you, and I'm not done. Father, let our roots go down deep into your love. We don't want to mix it. We don't want to sync it up with this world. We just want the supremacy of Christ to sit there all by itself. And this morning, from letters written in prison, we are reminded just how much you love us. We pray this. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks for joining us today. If you made a faith decision today, or you'd just like someone to pray with you, send us an email to office@capecodchurch.com and a member of our team will follow up with you personally. Also, if you'd like to give to support the mission of Cape Cod Church, you can do that easily on our website, capecodchurch.com, by clicking the Give button. And one more thing, since you stayed all the way to the end. If you thought of a friend today who could benefit from this message, we hope that you'll share it with them. You can do that easily by social media, email, or via text. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon.